Oh, do I have something to share with you today. The Sony FE 50mm f1.2 G Master. Sony were gracious enough to loan me this lens, and I've been shooting on it for the past week and a half or so, and I want to share my first impressions with you in this video, and oh my. This would be Sony's 60th E-mount lens. It's the 13th G Master lens, and it's the very first f1.2 lens, even though Nikon said a couple years ago that the mount, it's too small, it's not wide enough to accommodate f1.2. Turns out. A few first impressions with this lens. So as you can see, the rendering on this lens is absolutely gorgeous. Edge-to-edge sharpness is very impressive. Vignetting is really well controlled, and chromatic aberration, well, I had to try to get it. You can get it, and honestly, it was not easy. I had to get the sun right behind this blossom, but it's still easily fixable in post. This is now, I believe, the third lens that uses Sony's new Nano 2 coating technology, which is noticeably better than pretty much anything else available. So clearly, I am pretty impressed with the 50mm f1.2 G Master. In fact, if you remember a little over a month or so ago when I did my first impressions video on the 35mm f1.4 G Master, at the end of that video, my wish is that Nikon would do a 50mm as a G Master, and less than a month later, here it is. I doubt that Sony cooked that up in a month just because I requested it. This has probably been in the making for a number of years, but the 50mm lens is extremely important. If you look back through the history of photography, all of my heroes, people like W. Eugene Smith, Henri Cartier-Bresson, and you look at how many just incredibly famous photographs were done with a 50mm focal length, I think it's one of the most essential focal lengths for any camera. I mean, they used to come kind of standard as kit lenses back in the 80s when we still had film in cameras, and that was kind of the standard lens. It kind of sees what your eye sees. It's a very comfortable focal length. It's one of my favorites. In fact, I own way too many 50mm lenses, and it's the focal length that in my own work I use the most. Now, this is not Sony's first 50mm lens. There's been a couple. There's been a 50mm f1.4, a 1.8, there's been a couple 55mm, a macro version, but this is a really important lens because a lot of those lenses are earlier in the lineup. In fact, one that I want to compare this to is one that I actually like a lot, and it's the Zeiss collaboration lens, which was one of the first Sony E-mount lenses, and it's the ZA 50mm f1.4. The ZA lens is an f1.4. It is absolutely excellent, but unfortunately, like some of the other lenses in the Zeiss collaboration series, it is prone to purple and green fringing, and it's an older design. Now, that's not a complaint against the ZA. I mean, Leica lenses have chromatic aberration, but the ZA 50mm was a favorite lens of mine. The rendering would give you these beautiful circular textures, but it was never really distracting. It just really looked good. And the good news is that this actually carries over into this G Master version, the f1.2, and it's also a stop faster. So you don't lose any of the rendering, but you do clean up some of the issues, which is a big plus. Another way of looking at this, I've got two examples here. So what you're looking at is just the spherical highlights in out of focus rendering. So when we look at the ZA 50mm lens, you're gonna see there is considerable onion skinning. It's just not clean. And there's also green fringing. Now, if we look at the 50mm f1.2 G Master version, it's considerably cleaner and we don't have any of those chromatic aberrations. And this tells you a lot. Now, a lot of times when you see the onion skinning in the case of the ZA 50mm, this has to do with the tolerance that Sony is able to ground these elements at. Now, if we look at the 50mm f1.2 G Master, this uses XA elements, which stands for extreme aspherical. There's also 11 aperture blades, so when you stop down, you're actually going to keep the spherical highlights circular. This lens features 14 elements in 10 groups. There are 3 extreme aspherical elements. These are ground to super high tolerances, and they're going to give you that cleaner look. Another thing that's worth mentioning here is the front element on this lens is actually concave. There's only a handful of other lenses, the Nikon 50mm f1.8 Z lens, as well as the Hasselblad 45mm XCD lens. It's unusual. The MTF charts are extremely impressive and technically sharper at the corners than the quote-unquote competitor lenses. Oh, and speaking of comparing with the competition, so in the case of the Canon RF 50mm f1.2, you can see they're about the same size. What you can't see is this is over 900 grams and this is like 700 something. It's considerably noticeably lighter, and a lot lighter and considerably shorter than the Nikon 50mm f1.2 and Z mount. In my next video, I'm actually going to do a comparison test of all three of these lenses against one another. They're all more or less at the same price point. Sony has a slight advantage, and this is that this lens comes in at $1,999 USD. And also, I think it's worth noting that Sony has put a lot of development over the last couple years into a dedicated linear autofocus system. So theoretically, it's going to be more efficient, and I think one of the things I want to look at in that video is it actually faster and more accurate. High resolution has been a design priority of Sony's for a number of years now. Now, the 135mm that we saw was a complete home run for Sony in terms of resolution and detail. It's one of my favorite lenses, and every lens that they've done since seemed to be really impressive in this regard. So I tested all the lenses and all the test images that you're looking at here with my Sony a7R IV. So we're looking at 60 megapixels. When you zoom in, you're going to see extreme detail and resolution. So this image right here is a trailer that is a plant store called Grow. And if we zoom in on this was done with the 35mm G Master. You can actually see things like the hours they're open and all kinds of crazy details. So how does the 50mm G Master stack up? Well, there's a little self-portrait here, and if you zoom in, this was done wide open at f1.2, and you look in my eye, you can actually see the window being reflected. Oh, it's sharp. One day when it's a little easier to photograph people once again, you won't have to look at me, but I did some self-portraits so you can at least get a feel for what this lens will do with portraits. So we have a minimum focus distance of 40 centimeters. Now this is very close, but if we back up to a more comfortable distance, f1.2 is nice to have, but I'm going to be honest, I'm not a big fan of f1.2 on portraits. The nose goes out of focus. It's just such a shallow depth of field at that close a distance. I like to shoot at f4, and what's cool is this lens gives you a lot of options. Theoretically at f4, your contrast is going to tighten up, although this does pretty well wide open. But what this does is it gives you a little more depth of field to work with. The transitions are a little softer in the way they roll off, and you still get the out of focus areas and a little bit selective focus, and it looks really good. And I mentioned this earlier, but this lens has incredible autofocus. So we've got 4 XD linear motors, which are going to give you the most efficient and I think the fastest available on any camera system. I'm going to do this comparison in my next video with the Nikon and the Canon so you can see what the differences are, but I think it's worth noting that Sony is the only system that's designed for modern linear focus. They have the technology and it's going to give you the highest speed and absolutely no noise whatsoever. This is seriously quiet autofocus, and this makes this camera system really appropriate when you're in situations where you need to be really quiet. I'm going to do a more comprehensive review of this lens when I've had a little more time to shoot on it and time to get a lot more images. 50mm is an extremely important focal length for me. It's part of what I just like to see. It's part of what I like to shoot. And so it's something that I think has been a little bit of a hole in Sony's lens lineup for a while. Now there is the ZA lens, which I thought was a pretty good lens. So I can tell you after first impressions, at least, is it worth the upgrade? So there's about a $500 difference between these two lenses in terms of price point. Now, what are you going to get? Well, you're going to go from f1.4 just a little bit up to f1.2. To some people, that is a big deal. And if that is a big deal to you, well, $500 is going to be your upgrade. There are some other differences as well. The design is much more up to date into what Sony are currently doing. Now, you do have declickable aperture on the ZA lens. You do have an aperture ring, but you don't have the custom function buttons on the lens, which are very useful and convenient. You've got 2 of them. In terms of optics, well, this is going to depend on what you shoot and what your personal style is, but I can tell you that green and purple fringing are pretty much non-existent in the 1.2 version. They are very existent in this version. So if you shoot high contrast stuff and you get that problem a lot and it's worth the upgrade for you, you might want to consider it. I also think that the onion scanning and the quality of the bokeh is much better in the f1.2 version as well. They've done this without losing any of the characteristics of this lens, which I think is a big plus, because this was really actually a great lens. It just had some minor imperfections and issues with it. And of course, autofocus is a huge deal too, and this lens is going to be much more faster and more efficient. Now, coming from SLRs into mirrorless, the original autofocus just put motors on top of the rotational actuators that we already had in the lenses. Sony is actually doing these XA thrust linear motors now that really are noticeably better, so there's that too. But a lot of this comes down to personal opinion and taste. Is this a lens I will be buying? Heck yeah. But I would love to know what you guys think, and if there's anything you want me to cover in the full review or the comparison with the Nikon and Canon 50mm f1.2s, drop me a comment and let me know. I'll see you guys in the next video. Until then, later.